Good evening, everyone. I am Kizzy Kate Peters, a history tutor at University of Guyana, and I will be your moderator for tonight's podcast on Talks for Black History Month public lecture series, which is hosted by the International Decade for People of African Descent Guyana, IDPADA-G. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion where we engage with one of the most influential works in 20th century thought, Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. Written in 1952, Black Skin, White Mask is not simply a book about race or colonialism in the abstract, but rather it is a deeply analytical and psychological exploration of how colonial domination shapes identity, language, desire, and self-worth. Fanon challenges us to confront the invisible scars of racism, those that exist not only within institutions and social structures, but within the human mind itself. Fanon, a Martinican psychiatrist and anti-colonial intellectual, raises difficult and often uncomfortable questions about the lived realities of Black people in colonial and post-colonial societies. These questions remain especially relevant today as many communities continue to grapple with the enduring legacies of empire. This relevance is particularly evident in the work of the International Decade for People of African Descent, Guyana, IDPADA-G, an African-centered organization committed to highlighting the social, economic, and cultural challenges facing Afro-Guyanese, issues surrounding identity, marginalization, recognition, and psychological liberation, central to Fanon's analysis, continue to resonate within the Guyanese context and inform contemporary conversations about inequality, belonging, and justice. To guide us through Black Skin, White Masks, and to help unpack its historical context, central arguments, and continued relevance to societies like Guyana, we are joined this evening by Mr. Vincent Alexander, AA. Mr. Vincent Alexander is the current chairperson of the International Decade for People of African Descent Assembly, Guyana, IDPADA-G. As chair of the coordinating committee, he contributes his unmatched wealth of knowledge of Guyana's politics, history, and culture to IDPADA-G's mission. He is also the immediate past chairperson of the Burnham Foundation, which commemorates the life and contribution of former President Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham to national and regional development, Commissioner of the Guyana Elections Commission, and a member of the Coffee 250 Committee. Over the years, he has demonstrated an unyielding commitment to the development of tertiary education and social improvement in Guyana. Having joined the staff of the University of Guyana in 1988, he served as a research fellow and lecturer in the field of local government from 1988 to 1994, as Deputy Registrar from 1994 to 2009, and Registrar from 2009 until his retirement in 2015. He holds an LLB, Master of Law degree, and a postgraduate diploma in legislative drafting. As such, Mr. Alexander brings valuable insight to this discussion and will lead us through Fanon's exploration of race, colonialism, and the psychological dimensions of oppression. As your moderator, I encourage us all to listen critically, engage thoughtfully, and think beyond the surface of the text. Fanon doesn't ask us to agree. He asks for honest reflection. With that, it is my pleasure to invite Mr. Vincent Alexander to begin his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kit. I'm embarking on a review of Frank Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. This review gains its relevance from a number of factors. Firstly, it is being done in Black History Month, a month in which attention is paid and recognition given to individuals of African descent for their contribution to humanity, human development, in whichever sphere they do so. Fanon contributed as a philosopher and psychiatrist to an understanding of colonialism, colonization, and its impact on the African being, and the reaction of the African being to the impact of colonization. It is intended that it is contended that we are presently in a neo-colonial state, with experiences and challenges derived from our colonial past, and its continuation into the present, albeit in a new form of neo-colonialism. There are lessons to be learned that are pertinent to our present state from Fanon's work, since the challenges of today reflects the foundations of colonialism, which have fashioned our contemporary circumstance, the neo-colonial state. IDPADA-G has a body responsible for the actualization and articulation of the pursuits of the goal of the decades for the people of African descent. In this Black History Month, seeks to accentuate the need for the understanding of the state of African Guyanese and the required action for the attenuation of that state. This is but an aspect of our pursuit of recognition, justice, and development, the very goals declared by the United Nations for the decade. Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Masks. It's a psychoanalytical study of the humanizing psychological effects of racism and colonialism on Black people. Fanon argues that Black individuals are compelled to adopt white masks, assimilated white language, culture, and values to gain recognition within a society dominated by European colonialist structures, causing deep alienation, inferiority complex, and psychological spitting. The theme of Frank Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks essentially is internal conflict and alienation experienced by Black individuals in a white-dominated world. That theme can be broken down into 4 aspects based on Fanon's articulation. The first being psychological colonization. This has to do with the emergence of mental health issues stemming from the equation of humanity with whiteness. And I think we need to understand that when we speak of mental health issues, we are speaking about any mental state that is not normal. We're not necessarily speaking about a psychiatric state or a state of madness, as people may say, but any abnormalities that have been derived in one's mental state based on influences such as the one we've referred to, psychological colonization. It also speaks to the mask as alienation. Here the contention is that people have to mask themselves for the purpose of recognition. So they alienate from their own being, masking for the purpose of recognition. It points to language and existence. Language being acculturation for recognition and existence. And in fact, language becomes very critical because to a very large extent, language is a custodian of one's culture. And the extent to which, in this process of colonization, language is imposed upon the people of African descent, then in fact it represents a process of acculturation. And the other aspect it speaks to is objectification. That is to say, being seen as an object, except for instances of conformation to the white standards. In other words, people of African descent are not seen as subjects in relationships, in the relationship with others. They're seen as objects. They're seen as passive. They're not seen as active. They're being seen as acted upon rather than themselves acting. In that context, Fanon talks about the goal of liberation, realization of one's humanity. A humanity which is suppressed by all of the things I just mentioned: psychological colonization, masking as alienation, language and existence, and objectification. So his conclusion really has to do with liberation, realization of one's humanity. And that's to suggest that there is a process of de-civilization in relation to the people of African descent when one speaks about the question of humanity. In that regard, Fanon has 4 areas which he addresses 8 areas in which he addresses black skin, white masks. The first being the Negro and language. The second, the woman of labor and white men. The third, the man of labor and white women. The fourth, the so-called dependency complex of colonized people. The fifth, the fact of blackness. The sixth, the Negro and psychology. The seventh, the Negro and recognition. And finally, he comes up with his conclusion. In relation to the Negro and language, he emphasizes the assumption of a culture. Thus, we see with language, there's a morphing of the being through that language. The morphing, in some regards, of the black man through language into someone other than himself. In relation to women of labor and white men, he speaks to the question of the person I love will strengthen me. The need to earn admiration. And here, in a sense, he's continuing this theme of language. Because for the black woman, for the purposes of recognition and in the context of acculturation, here is she saying, the person I love will strengthen me. So in a sense, she's herself morphing in search of admiration, looking for the love of others, which in event represents value making, represents a superstructure of the world, a superstructure which is not founded in her being. On the question of the man of labor and whiteness, here again the question of culture arises. And here again, when we speak about the man of labor and whiteness, we see the imposition and the oppression and the black man in the course of labor seeking to embrace the values of the white, even as he's suppressed by the white, in search of acceptance and in search of recognition. He then speaks about the so-called dependency complex of colonized people. And here, the question of racism arises. The question of superiority and the question of inferiority. The consequences of colonization and objectification, where the very existence becomes a state of depending on the values and depending on the being of the mass person in relation to black skin. And then the fact of blackness. the fact of blackness, where blackness is seen in the context of an object in relation to others. Whenever they have to relate, they relate from the perspective of their blackness in relation to others whose values they seek to imitate. And then the question of the Negro and the psychology. And here the question of the family arises. That in fact, the thought process, the psychological being, is founded in family relations. And therefore, a normal Negro child who finds himself outside of that family is faced with the dilemma of values, is faced with the dilemma of originality, because in relating to others in the context of domination and colonization, the psyche morphs away from the originality of the site of the African person. Then comes the question of the Negro and recognition. The whole question of how does the Negro, in the context of domination, colonization, and racism, gain recognition? Because they are not in the first instance recognized as human beings. There's reference to them as being other than civil. In that regard, there's a process of their decivilization. And so, for recognition, there's a whole question of the African man being educated to be actional. And in being actional, to have be involved in a preservation of relations, seeking respect from the perspective of the values of the white, rather from the perspective of his own originality. Frank Fanon, in his analytical approach, postulates that identity has to be of the present. Now one has to note a peculiarity about Frank Fanon. Frank Fanon is doing this analysis from a psychoanalytical perspective. And from a psychoanalytical perspective, one has to deal with the individual rather than the aggregate society. And so we see Fanon here in his analysis dealing with the aggregate black person rather than the society at large. And so based on that, one does not necessarily get from his analysis the sociological perspective in its entirety, because he's dealing more with an accumulation of experiences of the individual black person, and in fact, some of his own experiences as a black person. It should be known that Fanon himself is from the Antilles, Martinique, French Antilles, ended up in Algeria, where he worked as a psychiatrist, and therefore is faced with the problems of black alienation and how to grapple with that alienation, even in the context of the work in Algeria, where he joined the liberation movement in Algeria, was unable to go to the fronts, but became a roving ambassador for the Algerians in their struggle for independence. So that his approach seems to be contrary to the dialectics of development, which sees development as a process birthed and reflective of past events. And here again, one has to understand Fanon's approach. Fanon is not concerned with who he was yesterday. He's, from a psychological perspective, he's concerned about who I am today, and the whole question of desire to be tomorrow. And so in that regard, he distanced himself a bit from many of the social scientists who really start to look at the question of identity from yesterday. The Fanon's position is, no, I'm not going back to yesterday. I am who I am today, and therefore the analysis has to be today. So in that regard, one might argue that he's a bit static, and may be well ignoring the realities of the past. But one sees in his work what may be called antinomity, and that is some contradictions in terms of the position he takes vis-a-vis the reality of what he actually does in his analysis, because he does in his analysis sometimes reference to history, not from the perspective though of history informing, but from the perspective of understanding that history is what he would have departed from. There he is, and from the understanding that what he's seeking to do is not to return to history, but to create a future based on a desire. I therefore want to turn my attention to a couple of things that Fanon had to say that are rather informative in terms of his understanding of things. First, he speaks about the postulation that black individuals are compelled to adopt white masks, assimilating white language, culture, and values to gain recognition within a society dominated by European colonial structures, causing deep alienation, inferiority complex, and psychological splitting. But having said that, he goes on to say that no matter how assimilated no matter how assimilated to white norms a black person may become, whites will always exercise a sense of inferiority, and that way of thinking was designed to keep blacks stuck in an inferiority status within a colonial order. So we see here that what is happening, the white themselves, in pursuit of their acclaimed superiority, continues to project the black as inferior, and in that regard seek to have the black only seen from the perspective of the inferior being. And this, when married with the fact that the blacks themselves, having morphed into the European culture, experience an inferiority complex, we then see a division of self-perception of the black subject. On one hand, he has lost his nature, his origins, and has embraced the culture of the mother country, and produces an inferiority sense of self in the black man. But even as he does that, the process of masking seeks to provide him the opportunity to be assimilated, but at the same time provide a guise under which he may in fact struggle against that masking. Fanon speaks about the question of violence, not in the typical sense of physical violence, but he sees the whole question of colonization, the whole question of racism, the whole question of domination as a form of violence. Similarly, he sees the reaction of the black to that state of violence as also another form of violence. So he embraces violence as an important aspect of the state of things, an imposition and a reaction. And he describes this state of things as a state of emergency. And this state of emergency he also describes as a state of emergence. So within this state of emergency, given the conflictual situation and the desire of the black to be liberated, here is the possibility of emergence. And here is one of the instances where the antinomity of Fanon comes out. Why does that? Why is that so? Because whilst he does not embrace historical dialectics, clearly this argument of a state of emergency as a state of emergence is a point of dialectics. The contradiction, the unity of opposites, and the possibility of an emergence based on the unity of opposites in the first instance, but the overcoming in that process of one element over another element. Now, Fanon speaks about the very nature of humanity and says that the black becomes estranged in the colonial condition, and from naked disability emerges not as an assertion of will, nor as an equation of freedom, but an enigmatic questioning. So the state of the black man comes one of questioning. And here, the question of the white man's eye, which is said breaks the black man's body. And in that act, it's an act of violence. And it frames a form of transgression. It feels of vision disturbed. And that's how he refers to the white man in that regard. So the argument is to exist is to be called into being in relation to another. So the black man's existence is seen not from the perspective of his own identity. It is seen from the perspective of another in the context of superior and inferior. And in that regard, even among themselves, when the blacks are relating, they do not relate in terms of any kind of equality. What they do, they judge each other based on the measurement of white superiority. So they look to the standards of the white, even among themselves, to determine their own being and their own relationship. And so that brings us to the question of the very place of identification. It's caught in a tension of demand and desire, and there's a space of spitting. That's what results from that tension of demand and desire. Demand for recognition on one hand, but the desire to realize one's humanity. The question of identification is never an affirmation of a pre-given identity, never self-fulfilling prophecy. It is always the product of an image of identity and transformation of the subject in assuming that image. So here is a question of the black, going through this process of a transformation in search for identity, transformation based on an image rather than any historical originality. And in that regard, how you are seen to be and how you are transformed and who you are in fact seen to be. So we see the question here of utter naked disability, where an authentic upheaval can be born. In that regard, it may be said, I owe it to myself to affirm, and here he's speaking now in the context of his experience in Algeria. I owe it to myself to affirm the Arab, permanently an alien in his own country, lives in a state of absolute depersonalization. The social structure existing in Africa was hostile to any attempt to put individuals back to where they belong. So we're talking here about the state of the enslaved vis-a-vis where he came from. The state of the indigenous enslaved person, detached from his roots and tribal and ethnic existence. And this really speaks to the question of colonial alienation, colonial redefinition, and colonial reclassification. It's against that context that he speaks about to exist is to be recalled into being in relation to another. It looks at the question of locus, the very place of identification. How can someone be seen to be? How can someone be seen to be in that regard? So that Fanon argues, in fact, that based upon derived from the concept of collective unconscious and collective catharsis. The Negro presents a brief, deep psychoanalysis of the colonized black person. The inability of that person to fit into the norms established by the white society. A norm that the Negro child, having grown up in a Negro family, will become abnormal on the slightest contact of the white world. That in white society such an extreme psychological response originates from the unconscious and unnatural training of black people from early childhood to associate blackness with wrongness. That such unconscious mental training of black children is affected with comic books and cartoons. So he's speaking about the kind of material that's in the public domain that seeks to be a kind of a caricature of who the black person is, subjecting the black person to that cultural media, and as a consequence to instill and affix in the mind of the white child the cultural representation of black people as villains. And black children themselves are therefore exposed to that image of the black villain. And that leads to the whole question of trauma. The black child being exposed to trauma. In that regard, one may well argue that the result of this process of colonization, domination, and racism creates a trauma in the black. And herein lies the state of the black who wears the white mask. Wearing the white mask is in fact a response in an attempt to overcome this trauma by looking for assimilation and recognition and acceptance. As it is argued, it's only when that recognition is attributed, then he sees himself as a being, though he's never seen as a being by the colonizer or by the white person. And this is very, very relevant to our own society, where Fanon's theory could be associated not only to a society of black and white, it can be associated to any society where there's domination, where there has been colonization and there's domination, and the domination may well be across different ethnic groups. And here's where one can in fact apply Fanon's understanding to a society, a poor society like the Guyanese society. Remember we said that even among the blacks themselves, they looked to the white standards to determine their own being. And in a society that is plural, not necessarily one that is still a colony, you may still have that effect across ethnicity where they look to the white standard, and in that regard, people of African descent may still find themselves in the same dilemma which Fanon spoke to, although at the time he was speaking to a colony. But in the state of neocolonialism, we can well see that there is a continuation of the institutional issues of colonization, and therefore the continuation of that black skin wearing white masks in an attempt to realize the standards that will accord him the state of being a human being. Against that background, Fanon concludes that there is but one approach to a resolution of this problem, and that approach has to do with education, bringing one into an understanding of one's own being and an aspiration into the future of whom he or she wishes to be, as opposed to whom he or she is. And so he sees education as a very, very critical element in the process of what we may call a decolonization, what we may call unmasking, and what we may refer to as being able to realize one's being into the future, because Fanon speaks about the desire to be, and that has a lot to do with the future, a future which is not a reflection of the present, but an emergence from the present, given his contention that the emergency provides the condition for emergence.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alexander, for that insightful presentation. We now welcome questions from the audience.
Any questions?
Not as yet. I want to ask. You want to ask something?
As we await questions, the need is to emphasize the relevance of the work of Fanon to today. First of all, we have to recognize this is Black History Month, and that Fanon has made a significant contribution to the understanding of the process of colonization, domination, racism, and white supremacy. And as Fanon himself spoke to the question of education, this understanding is critical in that process of education, because unless one understands the state, then one is not in the position to look for a remedy to that state. So, understanding what Fanon is saying, understanding the state of the being of the people of African descent is critical to being able to realize the way forward out of that state. It should be recognized that whilst Fanon to a very large extent did his analysis on the individual, he did indicate the whole question of interrelationships between individuals, and one may extrapolate to say that beyond relationship between individuals, one can also see this from the standpoint of relationships between communities, as much as it can also be seen as relationship between countries, the colony, and the former colonial masters, and even the state of the neo-colonial state, between neo-colonial states and the countries referred to as the developed countries. So this analysis can be taken to understand the state of humanity, starting with individual and going right up to relationships between states, and how there are those who are seen as being inferior, those who are seen as being superior, those who dominate, and those who are involved in the process of trying to bring themselves out of that domination and realizing their humanity.
Thank you very much. Fanon suggests that speaking the colonizers' language brings social acceptance but can distance Black people from their authentic identity. How does this idea help us understand attitudes towards Creole and African-deprived languages in post-colonial societies today?
First of all, I need to recognize that to a very, very large extent, language is the custodian of culture.
Yes.
language is really the complete expression of a people's way of life. And so when you adopt a language which is not an expression of your way of life, in fact what you're doing is going through a process of acculturation, where you have to respond to language in terms of what you do and your actions, and that in itself represents a transformation away from your own identity under the domination of the persons whose language you're using. Therefore, in this process of domination, an institutional arrangement is actually put in place to remove you from the use of your own language, because the use of that language will maintain your identity and your being, an identity and a being which the oppressors seek to suppress. And so language becomes a part of the process of liberation. If you are able to retain your language and to be guided in what you do by your language, which is the custodian of your way of life, then in fact you would be in conflict with the imposed language, but a conflict which represents an emergency and the possibility of the emergence if your language dominates. And so it's important for us to see the whole question of, in society like Guyana, Creolese, which expresses more of our being than English probably does. And so one has to look at the aspect of universalization, that English indeed can be used for universal interrelationships, but for the purpose of identity, one has to use one's own language and to understand that the English is but a tool and not the expression of your being, because that English does not speak to your indigenous existence.
Thank you very much. Fanon also suggests that food, like language, can reflect cultural assimilation. How can food choices show internalized colonial values and struggles over identity and worth?
Fanon spoke about the way in which the human being is fashioned by the environment.
Yes.
And when you speak about food, in the context of colonization, you see the colonized person being removed from that interaction with his environment, and therefore the natural development of that being, into a false development based on the imposition of foods that are not of the environment, and therefore creating a different scenario in terms of the individual's growth and development. On one hand, detaching someone from the environment, on the other hand, creating a false environment, and therefore lending to the creation of a false person. And again here the question of identity is affected, because it removes one from originality into something other than what's original. And it's also important to note from the standpoint of food that very often there's a recognition by Fanon that you can't, notwithstanding the fact that he does not have a sociological approach, he understands the importance of economics in the development of the individual. And the question of food is also tied to economics insofar as if one does not use one environment to produce one's own food, then one ends up being dependent on food from somewhere else, and in fact being removed from a source of economic growth and development in the forms of agricultural involvement and things of that sort. Also, the question of diet becomes very, very critical. History has already shown us that people of African descent are affected by certain chronic sicknesses that are related to the food which they eat, and that the food which they eat is not necessarily what originally came from their environment, be it in Africa, but it's food that imposes upon them a certain state of physical being that results in chronic sicknesses. But those foods are the source of economic wealth of those who produce and sell those foods.
Thank you very much. Final question. Fanon argues that colonialism forces black people to see themselves through the eyes of others, often leading them to hide behind a white mask. How does this shape identity, and what does Fanon suggest is needed for true self-liberation?
Well, first of all, it creates a false identity. It creates a false identity because it creates what may be referred to as an internal conflict. It goes against the very natural grain of the being in the creation of that false identity. Now, the question of the white mask then becomes another issue of that contradiction of being. Because on one hand, the white mask represents an attempt at assimilation, and therefore, in some regards, a recovery of a being that is recognized and accepted. Of course, that being is in conflict with the original being, but at the same time, the white mask also provides an opportunity for the struggle of emergence to be masked, hence not to be identified and pushed back against, at least in the inception, and therefore can become a tool also in the process of liberation. So there's a lot of contradictions in the existence. Contradictions that seek to impose, but contradictions that at the same time expose.
Thank you very much. Ms. Lawrence is asking, she said, in these neo-colonialist times, can you apply Fanon's principle of subjugation, especially in recent military action in the Caribbean and the choices of certain members of CARICOM?
Well, remember I said that this question of Fanon goes beyond now interpersonal relations.
Yeah.
Also can be seen from the standpoint of interstate relations. And it's in that regard that one can apply Fanon's theory, and it speaks to the question of the neo-colonial state. A state where the colonial masters are not physically present, but the institutional structures are still there internally, as much as the global economy is a reflection of those structures that work towards subjugation, suppression, and domination of state by state.
Thank you. Can you say a bit more on why Fanon seems to be outside of the focus of the struggle that is historical, political, and sociological, etc.?
First of all, we have to recognize that Fanon came from Martinique. Spent much of his time in Algeria. And in fact, his original works are in French. So Fanon has not historically been readily accessible beyond the French domain. So that's one of the issues. Secondly, Fanon used a psychoanalytical approach which brought him up against, in some instances, other progressive thinkers who were not using that approach, who used a more holistic and sociological approach. And the extent to which Fanon's analysis spoke to the individual And he emphasized the solid state of the individual. It's the extent to which some people would prefer to distance themselves from that. They're masked. They are actually masked in distancing themselves from that. But in recent times, there has been a relative reemergence of Fanon. I think that the whole question of the decades of the people of African descent and the whole consciousness, because a lot of what Fanon speaks about in terms of liberation has to do with consciousness. And once that consciousness has been engendered, then the embrace of Fanon gains some ascendancy.
Thank you. How would you apply Fanon's analysis to the current global situation of U.S. hegemony and reordering of the post-World War II global order?
I don't think that the hegemony which we are noticing is qualitatively different in terms of interstate relations. It is just an accentuation of interstate relations in the neo-colonial context. But if one looks at what emerged after the Second World War and the institutions that emerged, be it the World Bank, be it the IDB and other institutions, one could see that all of them in many regards lent to that antagonistic relationship between what may be referred to as the periphery and the center. And what we've seen in terms of the hegemonies being spoken about today is really an extremism. It is not it is not different in essence. It's just an extremism. And in some regards, from the standpoint of the oppressors, it is now a degree of unmasking. They too are unmasking because they also would have been involved in the process of wearing masks to disguise their being in relation to those whom they were seeking to oppress.
Thank you. And our final question is, can you give some concrete examples of how the white mask that originated in the colonial experience of white supremacy survives in our current environment and social relationships in Guyana?
Now, the international decade speaks to the question of remnants of the institutions and legal systems of the colonial state remaining in our societies.
Yeah.
And that is where we are in that regard. And a very good example of that, and Fanon speaks to that as well, is the question of education. Only 2 days ago, I was speaking to a young African Guyanese who attended a private school in Guyana. And she said to me, she had never been exposed to Guyanese history in the private school. She may have done some social studies, but absolutely no Guyanese history. What she was taught was British history. I can speak to that myself. My earlier days at high school, at a private high school, we did not do West Indian history.
Yes.
We did British history. And so we see there are institutions of the past which have been retained, and they represent institutional maintenance of subjugation and suppression.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Alexander. As we bring this discussion to a close, Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask reminds us that the psychological effects of colonialism extend far beyond political domination, shaping language, identity, and self-perception. Today's discussion has highlighted the continued relevance of Fanon's work in understanding race, power, and the struggle for self-determination in post-colonial societies like Guyana. We would like to thank you, Mr. Alexander, and our audience online for such a thoughtful and engaging discussion. Thank you very much.